Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of episode 9 of season 3 of the Orville called Domino. And this is probably the most epic episode of the Orville, and it wrapped up some of the bigger story arcs, and so it's strange that it's not the season final episode. And the episode begins with the Kelons trying to attack Zelea, which is a planet with a high gravity, which we've seen before, so we care about that planet. And so this kind of reminds me of how the Dominion attacked Beta Z during the Dominion War, and that planet was familiar to us from TNG, and so we cared a little bit more about it compared to if some random planet was mentioned. And the Orville and a small fleet of Union ships are defending it, and apparently they developed some kind of weapon which can blow up all the Kelon ships easily. And a minor nitpick I have is that this super weapon came out of nowhere. It was not mentioned before, and suddenly it's such a game changer because it can destroy all the Kelons easily somehow. And they didn't really explain it properly. They say that it works on all the Kelons except Isaac, because Isaac is separated from their collective network or whatever, and yet all the other Kelons are affected. And so an obvious solution by the Kelons would be to separate themselves into groups or into individuals, and that way to avoid the domino effect, and yet it was never mentioned in the whole episode, and so that was a little bit of a flaw in the technobubble of the episode. And so they come back to Earth and they discuss with the admirals about the possibility of building a bigger weapon to wipe out all the Kelons everywhere. And the dialogue is very similar to the TNG episode I, Borg, in which they also found a way to infect all the Borg with something to wipe out all the Borg, and then there was the discussion about the moral implications of whether or not they should use it, because it means genocide, and so even though the Borg were a big threat, they decided not to use it in the end because that's immoral. And in a later TNG episode, I remember Admiral Bicheyev showed up and told Picard that was a mistake, and if he ever has that opportunity again, he's ordered to do it. And it's funny that in this episode, there's also an admiral who chooses to do kind of a necessary evil for the sake of the Union, because he believes that they should use it on the Kelons. And it kind of reminded me of the Admiral Pressman situation when he talked about how the Federation made a big mistake of making cloaking devices illegal, because that's such a big tactical advantage over the Romulans, which they gave up. And so he was secretly building a cloaking device for the Federation. So we have a very similar kind of admiral here who wants to use the weapon against the Kelons. So he kind of reminds me of Admiral Ross as well, because he was also willing to do kind of a necessary evil, collaborating with Section 31 to save the Federation from the Dominion. But anyway, I'm jumping a little bit ahead. Before all of that, the Orville first flew to the Kelon planet and basically told them to stop all their aggression and to disarm all their armies, otherwise they will use that device. And the Kelons, having no choice, had to agree to that. Some of the dialogue also reminds me of the Voyager episode Scorpion, in which they kind of forced the Borg into an alliance because the Borg were being wiped out by species 8472, and Voyager found a way to beat that species, and they were willing to give it to the Borg, but only if the Borg cooperate with them. And so there's some similarity with some of the scenes with the Kelons being forced to negotiate with the Orville. It was a little bit strange how the Orville needed to land on their planet and to negotiate with them face to face. Isn't that kind of risky? Especially since it's the same ship which carries the weapon, and also with the only few crew members who know how to operate it, and yet they put themselves into the hands of the Kelons to negotiate with them. Why not to negotiate through subspace? And there's a lot of interesting scenes of the crew members of the Orville talking about the morality of the situation, of whether or not they should be using the weapon. Really similar to the TNG episode I, Borg, as I mentioned. Also, there's a scene in the end of the episode when Isaac talks with Kelon Primary about the Orville crew being his friends and all of that. So that reminds me of when Hugh told Picard, "Geordi must not be killed. Geordi is a friend." And here Isaac is telling them that the humans are his friends, and so a lot of similarities like that. And so the Kelon basically agreed to the truce with the humans, and the Orville comes back to Earth, and the crew are relaxing in some cabin in the woods. And there's a cute scene of Isaac with the Finn family, showing them the constellations and stuff, and seeing the northern lights and all of that. And it kind of reminded me of a scene from TNG when Data was describing watching a sunset with someone when he did some poetry reading to the crew, and he said something like, "So I did not explain why the sunset turned red, and we watched the occurrence in silence instead." And here we see Isaac explaining the occurrence to the Finn family, so I was reminded of that. And also in the end of the episode, you have the scene of Isaac addressing the crew and saying exactly how long he was serving with Charly, down to the last second, just like that. But anyway, I'm again jumping ahead. So anyway, they made the forced truce with the Kalons, and then we have a scene of a human walking into the facility where they keep the weapon in order to steal it. And at first I thought they were going to reveal it's a Kalon in disguise, that the Kalons pretend to be humans to infiltrate Earth and to try to steal the weapon or to destroy it. And instead it turns out that simply some humans do want to use the weapon against the Kalons, including that evil admiral. We see that the Maklans make an alliance with the Krill, since they got kicked off from the Union, and now they want the Krill's protection. And it's really ironic and hypocritical, since the Krill leader is a female, and yet the Maklans are willing to make an alliance with them despite having to obey a female, basically. So that doesn't really make much sense. And so a lot of the events in this episode feel kind of rushed. They kind of do so many epic things which in the old Star Trek shows would normally take place over many seasons, and yet they cram all of this stuff into one episode. So some of it feels a little bit rushed. And so the Krill and Maklans make an alliance, and then the Admiral shows up to give them the weapon which he stole, so that they will use it against the Kalons, and then they destroy his shuttle when he tries to get away, because they don't want him to inform the Union about their alliance, and yet the Union finds out like a scene later anyway, so that was kind of funny. And this whole thing of this alliance between the Krill and the Maklans reminds me of something that was constantly hinted as a possibility during TNG, when they constantly were concerned about the Klingons possibly making an alliance with the Romulans against the Federation, and every time that possibility was raised, Picard would always say that such an alliance would represent a fundamental shift of power across the quadrant, and yet it never really happened, and yet here it does. Even though the Krill are headed by a female, somehow the Maklans agree to cooperate with her, which seems a little bit strange and hypocritical. I am glad they did mention that fact somewhere, and it was implied that the Maklans' only real problem is that the Union tried to force their own ideals on them. They didn't have a problem being in the Union as long as they didn't force the Maklans to give rights to their own females, and so I guess as long as the Krill don't force them to do that, they can work with the Krill, so I guess I can buy that. And so the Krill and Maklans take the weapon to some Maklan planet, which has a huge quantum reactor that is big enough to power the weapon across light years to try to wipe out the Kalons. And so the Orville want to take a Union fleet to stop them, but they know they don't have enough ships, and so now they contact the Kalons to tell them what happened, to get their help as well. And so the Kalons become not just enemies in a Cold War truce, but to actual allies of the Union fleet, and they send their own fleet. And so that's what I mean when I say it felt a little bit too rushed, of how quickly all these things change, and so suddenly they were their enemies, now they're their allies. All of this stuff kind of felt a little bit too rushed, but visually this episode was brilliant. All the fleet battles were amazing, absolutely beautiful. The only minor complaint I have is that all the ships of each side look exactly the same. All the Kalon ships are exactly the same, which I guess does make sense since they're robots, so it's like a fleet of Borg cubes being the same, so that's fine I guess. But even the Union ships all look exactly the same, and that's a little bit disappointing. So it feels less good than how the old Star Trek shows, especially Deep Space Nine, had a lot of fleet battles which were really cool. And I would say those fleet battles in Deep Space Nine look better even till this day, even compared to this Orville episode, which is amazing visually, and yet the lack of diversity in the ships is kind of damaging your immersion, because you know they all look exactly the same, so they look like a copy-paste fleet. That's a complaint I had against Star Trek Picard, which showed the fleets of ships, and all the ships of each side look exactly the same, like just a copy-paste of the same ship 100 times, which makes it feel kind of less real and less impressive as some of the fleet battles in Deep Space Nine, for example, which always showed the Federation fleet being composed of so many different classes of ships, and it was never confusing because they still all looked like Starfleet ships, because they had the distinguished look of the saucer and the nacelles and all of that, and yet they had so many different classes of ships that they had some variety in them, and so it made it all look much richer and much more real looking because of the diversity. And yet here we have all these many different fleets, and yet each of them looks like a copy-paste of the same ship 100 times. So that's a small complaint I have, but other than that, The episode was visually beautiful, so many really good action scenes, and also some similarities to Star Wars, especially when the Krill are powering up that weapon, and it even kind of looks like the Death Star laser the way it's powering up, with all the beams being pointed into one spot, presumably to be shot out of it, and then the small fighters having to fly down there into a trench to try to disable it. All of that felt really Star Warsy, and meanwhile the Orville also sends a team into the facility to try to disable it from inside, and all of that part kind of reminded me of the Deep Space Nine episode To the Death, in which the Defiant crew had to cooperate with a group of Jem'Hadar to destroy an Iconian gateway which was a danger to everyone. And so the Defiant crew collaborated with some Jem'Hadar to try to destroy it, and they had to get into some building to do it. And also during the space battle, some of the Kaelon ships are basically ramming themselves into enemy ships to destroy them, and that reminded me of some of the Jem'Hadar tactics in the Dominion War. They would often ram their ships into the enemy to destroy it, so there was some similarities with that as well. And also in the end of the episode, after they capture Zelea and she's in the brig and Ed comes to visit her, that scene really reminded me of the Deep Space Nine scene when Gul Dukat was in the brig and Sisko comes to visit him to inform him that he will be tried for war crimes. And the same thing happens here when Ed informs Zelea that she'll be facing war crime charges, and I made the comparison before that she reminds me of Gul Dukat. Now it's even more apparent that they were probably inspired by some of the Star Trek episodes. And of course she has a daughter who is half human, just like Gul Dukat had a daughter who is half Bajoran. So a lot of similarities like that. I don't think it's a coincidence. It's obviously they were inspired by a lot of other Star Trek episodes, as well as some Star Wars elements, especially with that battle in which small fighters have to fly into that small trench to hit some specific spot to disable the weapon, and they're only able to slow it down, and in the end it is Charly who has to manually overload the reactor to prevent the weapon from going off. The only way to stop it is to make it destroy itself, and she has to stay behind to make it happen. And Kaelon Primary sees all of that. She sees that she's willing to sacrifice herself to save his people, because the weapon only threatens his people. And yet even though she hates the Kaelons and even thought that maybe it is the best way to use it against them, despite of that she's willing to sacrifice herself to stop it from happening. And that was some amazing character growth and character arc in this season, because she starts off hating the Kaelons to forgiving and then befriending Isaac, and eventually realizing that not all the Kaelons are evil, because she also met that one Kaelon who had emotions, which made them realize that the Kaelons can change, that it is possible to make peace with them in the future, that they're not all evil. And so anyway, she stays behind to destroy the weapon as the rest of them barely escape, as a chunk of the planet is destroyed in the explosion, and the leader of the Kaelons is amazed by that. And then we have that scene of Isaac telling them that that was what he was trying to explain to them, that these humans are different from their builders, that they do not seek to enslave them, that they're even willing to sacrifice themselves to protect them, and then looks at the bridge crew and says, these humans are my friends. And that really gave me flashbacks of that scene from iBorg. And it was kind of emotional in the same way, not quite as much, because still I think that acting in TNG was slightly better, so I would still say TNG was a slightly better show, because the execution of these ideas were slightly better, and also it was more original back then. Here it's kind of like a remake of the same ideas, and done slightly worse, because the acting is simply not as good here as it was in TNG, but visually of course this show is much superior since technology got better, and so all the space battles and stuff like that looks much better and more impressive, and it does make it kind of more fun overall. And so I would still say this episode is one of the best Orville episodes ever. It's definitely the most epic one with the most things happening, and it does have a moral center to it. It does have the morality debate, so it feels like it's about something, not just a space battle for eye candy, but it also is connected with the characters. And the sacrifice of Charly was kind of surprising, because they were building her up so much that I thought she's going to be a main character for a long time, and yet now they kill her off, but they did it in such a heroic way, and her character arc was so amazing in this one season. I do feel it is a little bit rushed. I think it could have been more impactful if we got to know her some more. If we knew her for a few seasons and then it happened, then it would be even more emotional. But still, overall, I think it was well done, and that final funeral scene definitely had some Star Trek vibes as well. I think even some of the music in some scenes kind of reminds me of some music from Generations. And even the acting by Seth MacFarlane, which I complained about before, was pretty good in this scene, when you can see that he's almost tearing up in the ceremony, and some of the other actors as well. So overall, this was very solid, very good, emotional episode, as well as some amazing visual effects and amazing fleet battles and epic galactic events. And we also had the scene in the end when the Kalons are discussing basically joining the Union after all of this, which again I feel was a little bit too rushed, like they were just their biggest enemy an episode ago and suddenly they're their biggest allies and best friends ever, so it felt a little bit too rushed in my opinion. You know, in Deep Space Nine when the Romulans became their allies, all of that was a gradual process across multiple episodes, and each time it was one more step. It was not all done in one episode, because it kind of makes it kind of unrealistic. Like things like that take time. It cannot happen in one day, and so that's a small flaw in my opinion. But I do love the idea itself, and even the execution of it is pretty decent. I do love how the Kalons kind of discuss among themselves in a kind of rapid machine noises. It kind of reminds me of how the Biners were communicating using some device to communicate faster than normal and all of that. It is a little bit weird how come the Kalons are not just communicating through some radio waves in a collective intelligence kind of way. Why do they need to communicate like individuals at all? And maybe that is something they should have established earlier on. As I said, the way the weapon worked by using their network could have been used as a way to explain why the Kalons would separate themselves into individuals and not be all connected into a collective hive mind like the Borg, but instead behave as individuals. That could be explained by the fact that they fear some kind of virus attack that will kill them all, and maybe that's what would separate them into individuals, and then later on they can have this kind of storyline and the Kalons communicate with each other like people. And so that's what I mean when I say all of this stuff was kind of too rushed. I think it could have been developed more gradually across many episodes, and then it will also feel more believable and will be more clever. So that's a minor complaint I have. But on the other hand, maybe it's a good thing they wrap things up more quickly, because that will force the show to come up with more original ideas more quickly. And so part of me is happy they're wrapping everything up more quickly. I just hope it doesn't mean that this will be the last season. I am hoping there will be many more seasons of the Orville, because I am enjoying the show overall. And this episode, I think overall, despite its flaws, was very epic and very fun, and had a lot of emotional moments and some morality tales, and all of that together makes this a very good episode in my opinion. And so it's not perfect, but compared to other episodes of the Orville, it's still one of the best episodes, and so I would give it a 10 out of 10. So that's my opinion. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss all of this in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.